this problem is predicated on the fact that where does the sovereignty of the state lie, and what happens when constitutional reforms are introduced in the states. Constitutional reforms, by that I mean introduction of democratic forms of government or any form of popular incorporation. So let me read a paragraph, and then probably I'll explain a little more as an introduction. On 15th October 1944, a press report in Hindustan Times argued that the Indian state, quote, that has ultimate constitutional existence only in the person of the ruler will not be possible in any other condition but the present. Furthermore, the treaties between the British and the princely states were like contracts between an overlord and his satellites that would not stand the examination of a democratic interpretation of sovereignty. This argument came in the wake of increasing demand for constitutional reforms in the princely states, the prospect of an Indian federation, as provided for by the Government of India Act of 1935, gave unprecedented urgency to reforms in the states. As the above quote implies, reforms in the states necessitated a fundamental change in the then status of the states as being bound to the British Crown through treaties, practices, usages. British treaty relationship with the princely states generated a historically specific politico-legal understanding of princely sovereignty, and this is something that I would explain, in which sovereignty of a state was seen as inherent in its ruler. In other words, colonial treaties considered state and ruler as inseparable. This conception of princely sovereignty, as this paper will show, posed unforeseen political and legal difficulties to attempts at constitutional reforms in the states. So what I'm trying to say here is that, so we have a situation in the 1930s and 40s when everybody's trying to constitutionalize, when everybody's trying to introduce reforms in the states, occasioned by both federal debates as well as the prospect of decolonization. But these states are running up against a huge problem, that is, what happens to their colonial relationship with the British when they introduce reforms in the states. And as we know, treaties were not signed between the people of the state and the British. There were only two parties to colonial treaties, and on the one side you had the British Crown, and the other side you have the ruler of the state concerned. So there is no category of people included in colonial treaties. So this is the problem that happens. So in the 30s and 40s, you need to incorporate people into this existing relationship, which creates a lot of problem. So what I want to do here is basically stick to the 1930s and 40s primarily, because I have something to say about the accession of the states into the Indian Union as well. What is the basis on which accession of states happen? It is actually my argument that the 1935 Act, which is basically the foremost, which is the longest constitution ever enacted by the British Parliament for the Indian colony, was a marriage of both constitutionalism of the directly ruled areas, that is British provinces, and the princely states. In other words, you could simply say that it was a marriage of parliamentary democracy and monarchical sovereignty. And this is of really great importance because this is the constitution that is providing for the federation. So federation was to accommodate both these competing and antagonistic constitutionalisms, that is monarchical sovereignty and parliamentary democracy. So I want to make two main arguments. The first one is that I want to argue that the constitutional debates in the 1930s and 40s were really predicated on the fact that the ruler of the state was the only sovereign of the state. In other words, the only legal personality, according to the 1935 Act in a state, was the ruler, and the people had no locus standi, as far as any matters went. And the second thing is, the second argument is, how do you think about decolonization in princely states? And I want to argue that decolonization in the princely states entailed a process of constitutionalization. So in order to decolonize, they had to constitutionalize, that is, to undergo some form of change in their present status. So in order to make these two arguments, I need to probably talk a little more about what is princely sovereignty that I'm talking about, because that is what the question is. So So I argue that princely sovereignty is a colonial construct that came out of the British relationship with the states. So the impact of indirect rule in the states in the 18th and 19th centuries conceptually realigned constituents of monarchical sovereignty, while treaty making and sharing of sovereignty among the Indian states predated British intervention. It was only with the British that constitutional fixity could effectively be given to the fact that sovereignty of a state actually rested with the ruler. So this was done through treaties and engagements, and everyday political relations between the states and the British was one. The resulting political practices and usages were another. So that is to say that people as a source of sovereignty does not figure in the British treaty relationships or in the British political engagements with the states. So I have actually a survey of like how this traditional power structures get realigned under colonial rule. So one of so two ways of looking at it, I think people have studied about this issue, like Norbert Peabody, Nicholas Dirks, Robin Jeffrey for Travancore. So I want to actually argue two things in this, the impact of colonialism on princely states and how it actually creates a notion of princely sovereignty. The first is by actually facing a... Did it just start working now? Okay. So the first is actually facing out of the traditional nobility which was always seen as a bulwark against royal despotism. So under the British rule, the nobility actually loses much of its privilege, and the British treaty relationships also remodels the office of Diwan, as I think most of the fact that some of the treaties actually provided for having a prime minister who would be a mediating force between the British and the monarch. So the British treaty relationship remodeled the office of Diwan so as to help check the excesses of monarchical power, a task very similar to that of the resident. So the appointment of Diwans for states were subject to approval by the resident and political department. In most cases, the Maharaja just appointed somebody as Diwan who the British advised them to be the prime minister. So as Norbert Peabody has argued in the case of Kota State, treaty relationships fundamentally restructured power relations by rendering the traditional nobility insignificant. So the realignment of power relations in the state through bureaucratization and the concomitant diminution of nobility under the watch of British have been attested to by Nicholas Dirks for Pudukkottai and Robin Jeffrey for Travancore. So the resident and the Diwan are seen here as doing a similar function, that is to keep a check on the Maharaja. But constitutionally speaking, Diwan of a state had no right independent of the ruler. All the powers that the Diwan enjoyed emanated from the monarch himself. And this is something that I argue on the basis of studying files on Cochin, where there was this debate whether the Diwan had any right independent of the Maharaja. And they thought that he did not. So there is no point in making an argument that the Diwan of a state had any authority independent of the monarch. So what happens under the British rule is that there is a centralization of power happening in states where the Maharaja or the ruler of a state becomes the sole legal authority, where he becomes the legislative, judicial, and bureaucratic authority of the state. So what I want to say is, the rulers of the states were always the absolute sovereigns of the state, even before the British came into the picture. But what is significant about the colonial intervention is two things. That is, monarchical absolutism in India acquired two new dimensions under British colonialism. First, it attained constitutional fixity through a realignment of traditional power relations in the states. So there is a constitutional guarantee to the fact that the ruler of the state is the only sovereign in the state. And the second is, of course, through the realignment of traditional power structures, which basically goes out of power during colonial times. So what I'm trying to argue, or what I'm trying to say rather, is the fact that under the British colonial rule, there is this essentialization of power in the figure of the ruler, who becomes the sole authority in the state. And this is something that comes out of treaty relationship, as I argue, because treaty relationships were not personal relationships of the ruler, even though they were entered into between the ruler and the East India Company first and the British Crown later. But the British argued that, again, in the case of Kochi, for example, that these were not personal obligations of the ruler, but of the state themselves. So I think the question then is, I want to go back to the 30s and 40s constitutional reforms after having told you what I think about princely sovereignty. So in 30s, what is happening is we have the Government of India Act, which actually promises a federation, which is giving a lot of push to reforms because states realize that in order to join a federation, they have to do some reforms first. But there was no constitutional resolution to the question whether the ruler of a state could divest his powers to a popular government. So that is to say, what does constitutionalization mean in the states? Whether a ruler could just decide today that I'm going to give all the powers to a popular government and let that popular government rule the state. What happens to that state's relationship with the colonial government? And this was a question that could not be resolved. So this kind of festers for right until 1947, until independence, that different people opined different things on this, whether, some lawyers just argued that the states could do what they liked, but some others argued that states could not introduce reforms and thereby take off the powers from the ruler who's supposed to keep the treaty obligations. So this is a problem that I'm this is a problem that I'm interested in for today. So I want to give an account of some of the attempts that states made to introduce reforms, for example, in Travancore, both before 1935 Act and after 1935 Act. So for example, as you know, Travancore had a legislative assembly from 1888 onward, but a constitutional question came up in 1918, which was regarding the powers of the Legislative Council to legislate on its own expansion. That is to say, the Legislative Council wanted to expand its membership from 15 to 25 members. So the question was whether the Legislative Assembly could do that expansion by passing a legislation by itself, or it had to be done by the Maharaja or by passing an edict or proclamation. So this seemingly innocuous question created a lot of confusion, and the question was referred to the High Court of Travancore, which opined that the Legislative Council had the right to legislate on its own expansion. But the Madras Advocate General, S. Srinivasa Iyengar, thought that it could not be the case, that a Legislative Assembly did not have the right to expand itself. So what he said was the law made by this is quote, the law made by the Maharaja is one made by the supreme legislative authority and must therefore prevail. One thing, however, is plain, that as the stream cannot rise higher than its source, a law made by the Legislative Council cannot have such a superior force. And then eventually the Foreign and Political Department actually interferes and advises the Maharaja that you should not establish a convention of giving powers to Legislative Council to enact statutes independent of you. So what I'm trying to argue is that the British were really unhappy with the fact that you could have a legislative assembly that had independent legislative powers. So in 1914, a similar question comes up in Cochin, where the Maharaja sought to introduce an administrative advisory council, that is to introduce popular representation in making decisions, which the British actually shelves that proposal. So these are some of the. All this is done on the pretext that the capacity of a ruler to meet treaty obligations will be compromised if any other source of authority comes up in the state. So, after the passage of 1935 Act, constitutional reforms become much more important. So there is this very famous question that comes up in Travancore in 1938. There's somebody by name T.M. Verghese, who is a Travancore State Congress member, who passes a resolution for self-government in Travancore Legislative Assembly in February. And this creates a lot of discussion in the state. And C.P. Ramaswamy Iyer, who was the Divan of Travancore at that time, he actually disallows the motion. And he states that the Travancore state is bound by the treaties of 1795 and 1805, and it is impossible for the Maharaja to divest his powers in favor of a responsible government. And he has a long speech on this question, which is really interesting. So what he was trying to argue, of course, it is happening in the wake of 1935 Act, which had already recognized the fact that the ruler of a state is the only legal personality in the state. So he goes on to say that the federation contemplated in the Government of India Act 1935 was founded on the recognition of the fundamental idea that ruler alone represents his state and that ruler is the government of the state. That is the title of my paper too. So the introduction of any form of democratic form of government was seen as incompatible with the treaty provisions of the treaty provisions of a particular state. So this question creates a lot of discussion. So what CP is giving as a reply to the proposal to reform. So this question creates a lot of discussion in the House of Commons, which I have actually, it happens for almost 2 years, in the sense that not every day, but a series of questions are asked in the House of Commons about CP's statement, whether it was possible, whether a ruler of a state had to get the permission of the paramount power to introduce reforms in the states. And I don't have time to go through all of this, but the first question was actually answered by Earl Winterton, who was the Undersecretary of State for India. And he basically said that, constitutional advance initiated by the ruler. The consent of the paramount power has not been required before such advances have been approved by various princes, nor, so far as I am aware, has it been sought in such cases. So this was seen, but nationalists actually took up, especially people like Nehru took up Winterton's statement as implying that the states had the absolute right to constitutionalize, as in introduce reforms. But if you follow the debate further, more questions were asked and the matter was getting more ambiguous. But I just want to end by probably talking about a question asked on 6th April 1939. So Lieutenant Colonel Muirhead in his reply, and I'll just read out the reply. So he is saying that the policy should not be, that the British policy should not be taken as implying that the paramount power would recognize a ruler as having endowed any constitutional body which he may create with a greater degree of authority than that which he himself is recognized as possessing. I'm sorry, this is like very rough language, but no state would be regarded as relieved of its obligation to the paramount power by the fact that its ruler had divested himself of the control of necessary to discharge them. So what he was basically trying to say that it was not possible for a ruler of a state to introduce a legislative assembly with powers which the ruler himself did not already possess. So this basically was trying to this problem again, so the problem is again, ruler is the measure of sovereignty in the state, that legislative assembly could not claim any authority that the ruler himself did not have. So this ambiguity regarding the exact constitutional legal position, and I stress this fact, I mean, one could make the case that, people could mobilize and, introduce reforms and, the British could not do anything about it. It could have been the situation, but the constitutional issue could not be resolved, whether it was possible for a state to introduce, for a ruler to divest his powers in favor of a popular government. And this issue remained unresolved, as I see, until 1947. But the state reforms, I mean, the people have argued a lot of things about state reforms. Most of them agree that state reforms were ineffective. But how I see the state reforms is that states were actually caught up in a very contradictory situation. That is, after 1935 Act, there is a constitutional recognition of the fact that the ruler of the state is the only legal personality, but at the same time, the Act is also, because the federation is coming up, the Act is also pushing states for reforms in the states. So which is actually a kind of contradictory situation. If the ruler is the only legal personality, how do you introduce reforms by divesting him of his powers? I think I'll probably just skip over the section. So I have a long discussion on the 1935 Act, but what is probably of interest today, because we are talking about transfer of power, so the instrument of accession that was provided in the 1935 Act. So if one reads the instrument of accession, for instance, it clearly states that a state can accede only into either union, India or Pakistan, only if the ruler of a state agrees to accede that state. It doesn't matter whether the people of a state is interested or not interested in acceding. And I think this is not happening, this is not happening just in 1947 or just in 1935. This has been the British position all along, that princely sovereignty meant that the ruler of a state is the only sovereign in the state. So I have a discussion of how princely, the idea of monarchical sovereignty, particularly ruler as the only single legal personality in the state, figures in the 1935 Act. So there's a lot of sections where one can actually cite, especially part 6 of the 1935 Act, which is actually about provincial autonomy. I think Aravind Ilangovin has recently studied this section. So what I want to stress here is the fact that, so if one looks at the federal debates right from the 1930 roundtable conferences, you have these conflicting set of constitutionalisms being in play, being put in place. So 1935 Act is one such instance where you have ideals of popular democracy being put in juxtaposition with monarchical sovereignty. And even if one studies part 6 of the Act, especially provincial autonomy, even in instances of provincial autonomy where supposedly free popular initiative is given, but still you have this princely state constitutionalism also in play. So what the states is running up against is some of the constitutional difficulties that is posed by their treaty relationship with the British, which have existed for a very long time, which, as I argue actually elsewhere, is generating a set of political constitutional categories with which these acts are made, for example. And one such category is the fact that ruler of a state is ruler and state are inseparable. That is, the ruler of a state is conflated with the state itself. So what happens eventually? Eventually what happens is that the reforms in the states were ineffective, or they produced mixed results precisely because it allowed states to pursue either path. They could constitutionalize if some states were really enterprising. But most states were really uncertain about the fact that what would happen if they had constitutionalized, what would happen to their treaty relationship with the British, and what would even happen in a post-colonial India where they were still thinking of being a part of a federation. So I probably will just conclude. Yeah. So for example, scholars like James Maynor have argued that lack of reforms in the states and lack of reforms in the states and the reluctance of the political department to press for reforms expedited the demise of states even before accession. I think, states not introducing reforms is expediting their death is something that, especially the volume edited by Robin Jeffrey, I think in late 70s on Paramountcy. Many people argue that the states actually collapsed because they did not constitutionalize, they did not introduce reforms. But I think such arguments do not actually explain the constitutional hurdles that both the states and the British faced in introducing reforms. Nationalist antipathy to monarchy was not just a desire for better governance in the states. If that was so, these states with progressive features should have been allowed to exist in post-colonial India. And furthermore, what is very interesting is, imagine a situation when all the states had constitutionalized. Then accession would have been a much more chaotic process, and accession would not have happened the way it happened, because accessions took place on the imperial constitutional fact, which basically means that, based on the constitutionalism of indirect rule, that the sovereignty of a state lay in its ruler, and he alone could accession the state into the Indian Union. And I actually also have So if one looks at this, I mean, I actually see what I call as constitutional efflorescence in the 1930s and 40s, because, princely states are making constitutions at this time. They are trying to, everybody is writing constitution at this time, and which we haven't, which people who study Indian constitutionalism haven't looked at them, because they all study what is happening in British provinces. So what is happening in decolonizing India is this competing, conceptions of sovereignty, that is popular democracy or popular sovereignty and monarchical sovereignty. But I think it's because of the. But we have a situation where monarchical sovereignty is completely disavowed by the nationalist, and that kind of comes up even in the nationalist accounts that we have of Indian princely states. This is actually from a larger work that I'm currently doing. So I actually kind of link up what is happening in 1930s and 40s in the princely states with similar debates in Europe, for example. So Richard Tuck, who's a very famous political theorist, has recently argued that the transition from monarchical sovereignty to popular sovereignty, for example, in post-revolutionary France, actually created a lot of questions regarding the separability of government, state, sovereignty, and ruler, for example. These categories were not clearly definable or separable in the case of even Europe, and people all the way from Hobbes down to Rousseau actually debated this question: what was the exact relationship between these categories? And what is further more striking is if one looks at Carl Schmitt. I really think that Carl Schmitt is really important to understand, princely sovereignty. So he, the very prominent Weimar political thinker, in a stunning critique, argued that parliamentary democracy and monarchy, a critique of parliamentary democracy, argued that democracy and monarchy could coexist. They were not incompatible political practices. So he argued that as long as democracy was a polemical concept, that is the negation of established monarchy, it would be joined and reconciled with various other political formations. So Indian states were actually trying to do something of that sort. They did not think that monarchy was incompatible with democracy, but in nationalist discourses, they are always incompatible, competing They're competing, but they were not completely incompatible. For example, I have actually studied the 1946 Travancore Constitution, American model constitution, which actually tried to do the same. It had the features of both parliamentary democracy as well as monarchical sovereignty. So that is why I think these princely state constitutions and reforms are very important, because they are much more complicated, and they thought about complex post-colonial state orders and constitutions than what we see in British India, for instance. I'll just read one paragraph as a conclusion. Probably it's a little vague. Histories of decolonizing India have yet to have an account of either the eventual triumph of popular sovereignty or the accession of Indian states into the Indian Union in 1947, written outside the teleological tyranny of the nation-state. The easy dispensability of monarchical sovereignty as an analytical tool to study decolonizing India has resulted in shrinking spaces from where one could critically study the nationalist advocacy of both parliamentary democracy and the nation-state. It has also resulted in sidelining the impact of indirect rule and its constitutionalism in shaping the competing projects of world and state-making in the last few decades of the empire. Despite their long-held opposition to monarchical sovereignty on both political and theoretical and whatever terms, the nationalists were quick to accept the fact that sovereignty of a state inhered in the ruler for accessioning states into the Indian Union. Perhaps such a move could have been realistic and pragmatic, yet neither of those could give a constitutional basis to the accession of states. For accessions were ratified according to the 1935 Act provisions, and it could only be justified according to the provisions of the 1935 Act and not according to the categories of popular sovereignty or democracy or whatsoever. So, for example, the accession of Kashmir, like all other states, is constitutionally valid especially in international arenas like United Nations, where the case did go to the United Nations, only on the fact that ruler of that state had acceded to India despite popular opposition. So, legally speaking, it was the discretion of the ruler to join or not join the union. So I think the irony of post-colonial India attaining its freedom and territorial contours through a validation of monarchical sovereignty, I think should not be lost on the historians of decolonizing India. I'll stop there. Thank you.